Thank you, and welcome everyone to this month's Connect with Remedy monthly webinar series. Before we get started, I wanted to tell you during the webinar presentation, you're able to ask questions to our panelists via the Q&A pod, and they will be answered during the presentation. This webinar will be recorded. All the Q&A will be posted along with the recording within 1 week of the presentation. And so with that said, I'd like to introduce the Remedy 9 Configuring Email Engine in a Server Group Environment. Our presenter today is Doug Reif. He's a Principal Technical Support Analyst in our support department. Doug?
Hi, thanks Greg. As Greg said, my name is Doug Reif. I've been here in support for about 20 years. My focus is with the AirSystem server, and I work with a global server support team. A support team for the server team around the world to provide technical help and training on both current and future products and architectures, as well as interworking with other components. So I'm very glad to be here today to hopefully provide you some help with the email engine. Many customers view email notifications as a critical component of their ITSM environment. You know, if email engines aren't being sent, people don't know that there's important changes going on or that they need to respond to something. You know, a lot of customers use notifications to make folks, VPs, managers, whoever, aware that something needs to be taken action upon. Also, many users depend on email to send approval requests and to process those. If email engine isn't processing incoming requests, approvals don't get completed. So for those and many other reasons, it's real important to have a properly configured email engine. The webinar today will discuss the configuration of the email engine within a server group, because there are some server group specific features I want to talk about, but configuration in general as well. And we'll cover some troubleshooting information just to make sure that you can get a properly configured email engine. Configuring the email engine for a server group starts with configuration of a thing called the ServiceSpellOver feature. I'll show you what this feature does and how to configure it. And then next we'll look at just general configuration for the email engine. I'm going to show you a couple scenarios where this new Fellover feature really comes in handy to provide high availability and load distribution. Followed by a section on troubleshooting tips and tools. There's a new tool I want to show you. And then most of the information covered today is actually documented either in the documentation or in the knowledge article, and it's readily available. So at the end I have a couple pages of references so you can use. Once we're done today, this presentation will be posted and you can go back and reference that. And at the end we'll have a Q&A section. ServiceSpellOver is actually a new feature as of 9.x. It provides a new method of failover that's really useful for keeping the email engine running. There's some new terminology that comes with the service failover feature. We call the component that is consuming this feature a companion service. So you'll hear me today use this term companion service over and over again. Email engine and normalization engine are the only two components in a Remedy environment that are supported with this new feature. So typically you'll have an email engine and a normalization engine companion service. Each companion service supports one or more services. So another term I'll use is services. Email engine supports an incoming service and an outgoing service. In the old server group failover system, the entire AR server had to become unresponsive in order for the email engine or any operation to fail over. But one really cool feature with the service failover is if the email engine alone stops responding, then whatever that email engine was doing will get failed over. So just the unresponsiveness of a single email engine now calls a failover. So a failover is completely independent of the state of the AR server. Being independent of the state of AR server, email engine can actually run on a system by itself that doesn't even have an AR server on it, and it can still participate in the failover. This is a look at a high-level view of an email engine failover or high availability environment. Since email engines are not tied to specific AR servers, you could actually have more email engines than AR servers. This might be appropriate if you have many mailboxes, and I don't know if any of you have this situation, but I work with many customers that have 20 or 30 or more mailboxes, and a lot of those mailboxes actually need a lot of horsepower because they're doing a lot of work. So you can add email engines to provide enough horsepower to get all of your mailboxes to be able to flow. But you also might choose to have a simple layout like this, where you simply have a primary and a failover email engine. Here you can see email engines 1 and 2 are the companion services that we talked about, and each of them provides the services for incoming and outgoing. So this scenario gives me good high availability because one email engine is always ready to perform the work if the primary one is down. So in my example here, email engine 1 is ranked 1 for the incoming and outgoing mailbox. It's doing all the work, and if something happens to that email engine, then the second ranked server email engine, which is number 2, will take over on all that. So to support the service failover feature, there are 3 new forms that we've added. The main form for configuring service failover is the AirSystem Service Failover Ranking Form. And some of these names, in fact, every time I mention a form name today, it's probably a long name. AirSystem Service Failover Ranking Form. From this form, you'll manage the ranking of each service. Each mailbox is a service that can be ranked across any companion service, in this case the email engine. You can view and change entries in this form to set your rankings, but the initial rankings are automatically configured. So once you've upgraded or installed 9.x and you've installed and started your email engines, and at the end of the install the email engines likely would have started, once that happens, you're already ranked to some degree. So the initial rankings are automatically ranked. Every time an email engine starts up for the first time, it adds itself to the service failover ranking form with the next highest rank. So the very first email engine would get ranked number 1, and the second email engine would get ranked number 2, etc. And then you can come back here and modify those rankings. There's a good chance that the order that you started up or installed your 9.x boxes is not necessarily the order that you want the rankings to be left in. So you'll likely come back in here and do some modification. This is what the form looks like. So you can see on the top list there, you can see every mailbox, both incoming and outgoing, is listed once for each email engine. The server name that you see here must be resolvable for every server in the group back to the original system that's running the email engine. As I mentioned, the ranks are automatically added the first time you start up the email engine, but you can easily change them here just by changing the integer value in the rank field. And it's dynamic. Once you change it, it just takes maybe a couple minutes for that to happen, and whoever's ranked number 1 will lose control, and whoever is the new one will then gain control dynamically. So this is something you can switch on the fly. If you've used the old server groups from prior versions, you know that sometimes you had to restart servers in order for the ranks to take place, and that's a little bit different here. The second form we want to talk about with this feature is the AirSystem Service Failover Whiteboard form. This form stores the current status of every incoming and outgoing service on every single email engine. You can use this form's entries to see which clients are providing a service, waiting to provide a service, or are unavailable or down. Just like the other form I just showed, this one's automatically populated as well. Typically, you wouldn't be modifying data in this form. You'd just be viewing it. And this is what the form looks like. Again, you'll see each mailbox listed for each email engine, and each mailbox will have a status. Ideally, what you'd like to see when you look at this is that every mailbox is actually active on some email engine. That's your, hopefully your goal is, if you created a mailbox, you probably want it processing, and if it's processing, it'll show up as active here. And any other email engines that are up and running but are not ranked number 1 will show up as waiting. So what you see here is actually a good status to have actives and waitings. And I'll periodically come back to this whiteboard form just to see that and make sure things look good. We'll look more at logging later. I have a few slides where I'll go into detail on different types of logging. But here's an example of a log snippet from the main email engine log showing that it's telling AirServer that it's ready and waiting. So you see here, let me get my pointer. See here, it's asserting its waiting state. So email engine starts up and it says, hey, I'm ready, I'm waiting. And then it gets a notification, or it's contacting AirServer. AirServer responds and says, hey, you own this mailbox. In this case, it's this incoming /9B in. And so it receives an event saying that, hey, you own a mailbox and you should be active on it. Email engine says, okay, I'm activating on that mailbox. And in this case, it also receives an event that it owns a second mailbox, and it becomes active on that. And at this point, in the whiteboard form, I would see it showing active for those 2 mailboxes. Okay, let me get rid of my pointer here. Okay, another term we use with the service failover feature is called the heartbeat. Companion services periodically assert their state, and what I just showed you was during a startup. During a startup, it asserts its state, but also periodically, the email engine will assert its state in the form of a heartbeat. A heartbeat is just an AR API call that runs in a standard fast thread and informs AirServer of its state. So email engine, in the log I just showed you, email engine asserted that it was in a waiting state. Then it learned that it owned a couple mailboxes and became active on those. When the AirServer does not detect a heartbeat, it instructs the next ranked server to become active and take over. In a moment, we'll discuss the new service failover server group operation. There's a new server group operation that you need to be aware of, and that server group operation is the operation that pays attention to this heartbeat. So there's one server in the server group that owns this service failover operation that is listening for heartbeats. And if it's not getting a heartbeat every 30 seconds, then it thinks something's wrong with that email engine and we need to handle it. So that's what the heartbeat does. The third form, I said there was 3 forms. The last form is called the Service Failover AirSystem Service Failover Interface form. This is a system form and it has no data or workflow on it. Companion services, again, there's only 2, normalization and email engine. So in our case, email engine saves data to this form, and that data gets automatically pushed with no workflow. It's all internal. Gets automatically pushed into the service failover whiteboard form. So this form is used as, hence the name, an interface. It's used as an interface between the companion service and the whiteboard form. So you won't see any data on it. The only evidence you'll see, and I'll show you in a little bit, is you will see that in the logging, you will see that the email engine is actually pushing data to this form. And if you looked at the other logging, filter API and SQL log, you'll see that data being pushed into the whiteboard form. Next slide. Okay. Just as a quick review, I mentioned the email engine asserts its state by way of an AR API call that happens every 30 seconds. So this little snippet here is AR API logging. So it's the client-side API logging showing the email engine doing a create entry API call into the service failover interface form. Here you see it's asserting its state, so it's doing a create entry. It's setting its state for 2 different mailboxes, both the 9B in and the 9B out. And what I would expect to see if I left logging on long enough is I would see this happen every 30 seconds. In order for the heartbeat to be detected by the server group and the services made active, the service failover operation that I just mentioned must be ranked. So this is kind of important. With 9.x, you may or may not have realized that there's this new item in your ranking form called ServiceSpellOver. It has to be ranked. We've had issues with Email Engine not becoming active, not sending emails, and the reason was the customer wasn't aware of this setting and hadn't ranked it. So it's very important that you be aware of this, and it is ranked. And this is an important service, so this is something you may want to rank on multiple services. If one or two servers goes down, you may want to have it ranked on a third one to make sure that somebody owns this feature. If it's not ranked properly and no server owns this operation, then no server in the group is going to manage the services and listen to the heartbeats, and no email engine will be active. So another thing to point out here is the email engine item here is no longer used. You still see it here. You can remove it if you'd like. It's simply no longer used. All of the ranking for email engine is now in that ServiceSpellOver ranking form. You can feel free to remove it, feel free to delete it. Just don't be confused by its presence here. So here's a flow diagram I want to show you with the different states. As you can see, there are 4 distinct states for each service. Active services can go into a waiting state if they've been re-ranked. So typically an active service would stay active unless the service crashed or something, but it would only go into a waiting state if it had been re-ranked and it no longer owns that operation. It can go into a suspending state if the heartbeat wasn't detected. The service failover controller will put an email engine into a suspending mode if it hasn't heard a heartbeat. So if the service failover controller doesn't detect a heartbeat, it doesn't know whether that email engine is down or just slow and hasn't been able to send a heartbeat within 30 seconds. So it can't assume that it's dead and not responsive. So the first thing it does is it sends an event saying, hey, go into suspending mode. That email engine then will get the message it's suspending, and it won't be trying to send emails, even though it might have been up and maybe it just couldn't send the heartbeat within 30 seconds. Now it knows, okay, I'm up, but I'm suspended, so I can't send anything. It'll not try to send any emails. So the next email engine then that was ranked will now become the higher ranked, and the secondary one will become active, and there won't be any duplicate emails. So this suspending status here is a way to prevent duplicate emails during a failover and takeover of the control. If after a couple of heartbeats an email engine appears to be healthy again, then it will go back from waiting back to active. So that's why you see the loop here from waiting back to active. If a heartbeat continues to be undetected, then it will go from suspending into unavailable. Services that are not ranked number 1 but are healthy will be in a waiting status until they get bumped up to be the owner of that service. So that kind of shows the flow from one status to another. And since I've mentioned all these, I do want to just take a minute and define these statuses a little better. Active means that, so when you're looking at the whiteboard form, that's what these are. Active means that the service provider is actively processing requests. The service provider, so that's another term we use. Service provider is the companion service. If you look at our documentation, sometimes we use the term service provider, and it's just to mean a companion service. Suspending means AirSystem server did not detect a heartbeat, so the service provider has been told to complete or abort any in-progress operations and relinquish control of the service. Unavailable means that the heartbeat continues after multiple 30-second intervals, continues to be undetected, or that the email engine actually went down gracefully. When an email engine goes down gracefully, it sends a note to the server in the server group that owns the service failover feature and says, I'm going down, and that status then becomes unavailable. And then waiting, as we mentioned, means that that service provider is up and running and healthy. It just doesn't own a service at this point in time. All right, let's talk then a little bit about configuring in general. This can be a fairly complex topic. If you've been around and worked with Email Engine a bit, you know there's a lot of different places that you can do the configuring. So I've listed, I think, most of them here. And some of them I'll go into more detail, some of them I'll just gloss over. But first, the centralized configuration really is the main place to configure the email engine itself. And I will talk more about that. You also still use the email daemon.properties. In past versions, you may recall you've used email daemon.properties, but not centralized configuration. Now with 9.x, you'll use centralized configuration, but still the email daemon.properties to some degree. The AirSystem email forms, like the AirSystem email mailbox configuration form, you use those to configure, so we'll go into more detail on that. I've already talked about the service Fellover forms. Because they're an important component, I'll probably bring those up multiple times. The AirSystem server group operation ranking form, I won't go into again, but you just need to remember that you do need to pay attention to that because of that service Fellover feature. And lastly, the service on Windows or the startup script on Unix, you can do some configuration in that as well. So, as I mentioned, centralized configuration is the main place to configure the email engine settings. In versions 9.0, most of the parameters, not all, that were in the email daemon.properties have been pulled into the centralized configuration. Now that we have this interface that I'm going to show you in just a moment, a nice interface for configuring the centralized configuration, we prefer that you use that interface. That is our, if you've configured AR Server, you probably know that we prefer on AR Server that you use centralized configuration to configure it. If you've ever had to configure a plugin server, you probably know by now that if you've been using 9.0, we want you to use the centralized configuration interface to configure that. Likewise with Email Engine, we prefer that you configure it using the centralized configuration. For all the settings that are in there, there are still some settings that you still need to manually edit the email daemon.properties file for. One thing that's cool with the centralized configuration is in past versions, maybe you've had an email engine problem in the past, you've called support, and we've told you to enable what we call finest logging. And what you had to do was go and find the logging.properties file for whichever version of Java you were using. You had to go locate that file, add some parameters to it, and or modify them, and then restart the email engine. So with 9.x, you no longer need to think about the logging.properties file. Any of the parameters that you would have edited in that file are now in the centralized configuration. They don't go out and update that logging.properties file. You can just completely ignore it now. But the settings, and I am going to talk about those settings, but those settings that you would have used to change the log level now are in the centralized configuration. And lastly, the really cool thing about centralized configuration, if you have used it, is that you know that you have access to every server in the group from one interface. So if you had 10 email engines in your group, in the past, if you wanted to modify configurations, you'd have to log into each of those email engines, or in the case of like the logging.properties file or email daemon.properties file, you'd actually have to get into the file system of all those 10 email engines. That's a really cool thing with centralized configuration. You don't have to do that. You can do it all sitting at one desk on one mid-tier, logged into one UI, and configure all those email engines. So again, as I know maybe not all of you have used the centralized configuration, so just a quick slide to show you how you get to it. If you want to go back and try this out, you simply go to the AirSystem Administration Console, click on General, and a System, and then General, and then you'll see the centralized configuration option there. And once you click on that, you'll see this menu here. This is the centralized configuration main user interface. The first thing it gives you is a menu of the component name, and hopefully it's clear here. There's a component called com.bmc.airsys.email-daemon. So the email daemon is the one that you care about for this. And on the right-hand side, you'll see I get a list of every email engine in my, this is not a list of every AR server in my server group. This is a list of every email engine in my server group. I mentioned in an earlier slide that you could actually have an email engine installed on a box that didn't have AR server, and that would show up here. It would, so you can actually configure email daemons on servers that don't have an Air server, and that's done through this screen here. So once I pick one of those server names there, I'll come up with this, which is the values of all the settings. So here I can see all the email daemon, or all the centralized configuration settings that came from the email daemon.properties file, and I can set them here. There's some examples that I underlined here, like the AirSystem handler.level. This is one that you use, and we'll talk more about today. But this is one that came from the logging.properties file. Now it's here. If you want to change the log level for the AirSystem email error logs form, you would do that with this. Another one is the .level parameter. If I want to change my email engine logging to finest, I would do that here. But and all the rest of the parameters, these are all the ones, if you've ever edited the email daemon.properties file, these are all the types of things that you would have edited, and they're all here available in this form. One second. Let me catch my notes up. So now let's look at the email daemon.properties file itself. This file includes a copy of all the settings we just saw in the centralized configuration. If you change or add any parameters in the central config, it does update the email daemon.properties file itself. And it also contains other information that isn't in the centralized configuration. So any information that the email engine has to have in order to connect to an Air server is also in the email daemon.properties file. So in the email daemon.properties, there will be information on how to connect to an Air server, and that usually happens through a load balancer. Anymore, in 9.x, each email engine does not have to connect to a local Air server. There's no reason to, so we prefer that you connect to a load balancer. So that email daemon.properties file will now have the settings for the load balancer to connect to. Once the email engine starts up, it uses those parameters, it connects to an Air server through the load balancer. Then the first thing it does is it reads the centralized configuration to get all the rest of the parameters. So even though there's a copy of those settings that are in the email daemon.properties file, the email engine doesn't use those. It's there as a copy, but the email engine actually reads the database. It reads the centralized configuration, and it gets its parameters from there as it's starting up. So, but it's probably good to know you can edit this file. One of the features with centralized configuration that's true with Air Server, with all the components is, well, at least shouldn't say all of them. With some of them, you can update certain config files, and Air Server notices that the file was modified, and it will load those in. It will load the changes in, and that happens here. You can modify the email daemon.properties file. It will update the central config. Again, I want to stress, we prefer you to use the centralized configuration as your main point of changing configuration parameters. This is an example of my email daemon.properties file. And you can see, again, all the settings we just showed you, but the things I want to point out and highlighted in yellow is this is kind of what you would expect for all those parameters that were not in the central config. I have those highlighted. So you see all the password name, password, authentication string, TCP port, RPC socket. All those are the things that help connect to the Air server. And those you do need to manage from the file itself. Okay, here's a list of the email engine forms, and this is not all of them. This is just some of them that are used for the main configuration. The main configuration form is the AirSystem email mailbox configuration form. This is used to create incoming and outgoing mailboxes and contains all the protocol and mail server information and login information to connect so that it can send and receive emails. It also contains other configuration information on how the email engine will behave with that mailbox, such as the polling interval. If it's an outgoing mailbox, it'll say whether or not to delete notifications after they've been sent. If it's an incoming mailbox, it'll have settings on whether to parse and execute the emails if there's a template. Another form you can use to configure is the AirSystem email Fellover mail server configuration form. Long name, but what that form does, it allows you for any mail server that you're connecting to with any of your mailboxes, it's possible that at some point you got a connection error. I could not connect. This form allows you to create a failover host name. So if if I had a POP3 mailbox or post office out there, and I couldn't connect to it, if I had another POP3 mailbox servicing the same information, I could create a failover entry. And the email engine, as soon as it had a connection error to a mailbox, it will look at this form. It'll say, hey, you got a failover host. Let me connect to that. And then we'll try that instead. The next one, AirSystem email messages, it's not really a configuration form, but you can use it to help when you're configuring the email engine. This form is typically where you find all the outgoing notifications, and when the email engine processes notifications, it gets it from here. This is basically the queue for outgoing notifications. It's also where incoming emails get stored. So if you send an email engine processes it, it puts it here. It may end up deleting it, but at some point it's here. You can use this form to manually send emails when you're testing your outgoing mailbox, and you can look at this form to see if incoming messages have come in. So, and I am going to talk more about that in a minute, show you an example. The email security form may or may not be something that you use, but you can set up, this is a whole concept in itself, you can set up security, like you can require, if you have users that are going to be submitting tickets through email, you can require that they have a security key, and you would define that kind of security process with this form. So it is a configuration form, but just for security. Also, the AirSystem email templates form is a form you use for configuring mostly the look and feel of your email. So you can use it for branding, putting logos on, and formatting emails as they go out. This is the AirSystem email mailbox configuration form, and you can see the fields where you define whether it's incoming or outgoing, what protocol you're using, and the information about your post office IP address or the host name, the port number. It's also where you would tell whether or not it was going to use SSL. You might have to change the port for SSL, and all the configuration to connect to your mailbox. So if you had a problem with a mailbox not connecting to a post office, this is probably one of the places that you come and look. If it's not connecting, it's probably a configuration issue, which is in this form. This is the AirSystem email messages form. So this is where I said it stores both the incoming and outgoing messages. This is an example of one record here, but if I did a query on this form, I would see the results list would show me all the incoming and outgoing emails in that list. And what here I just happened to select a particular outgoing test message. One cool thing about this form, and this is why I bring it up in the configuring section, is you can, on this form, you can actually send emails. This is actually an email client, and it looks like one, right? I can go in here and I can put all the pertinent information, in mostly a to address, a subject, and a body, and I can click on the send button, and it will send. So it's a way that I can test. I can just go to the inbox that I sent to, find out did it receive the email or not. So in this case, I can go to test user 1's mailbox. If he received the email, then I've just proven that this mailbox works. So that's why I use it for configuration purposes. It's just to test to ensure that it's working. The same thing with incoming. I could send an email from another client to the email engine, and then come here and look for the incoming message and make sure that the email engine did receive that message. All right. The last place to do configuration that I mentioned is with the startup routine. So that's either the service or the script. On Windows, it'll typically be the service. On Windows, you have a choice. You could run the email engine from a command prompt. That's typically only used for troubleshooting. Typically, it's used as a Windows service. And on Unix, it's always a shell script. By editing the startup, whichever the service or the script, you can do things like adding a certain debug mode to get more information about connection errors. You can change the min and max Java heap size. Another thing you can do, you may not be aware of this, and this training today is not about this particular topic, but this is something you might want to look at, is a lot of customers are wanting to use TLS to secure their connection with Email Engine. And this is something you can do by editing the startup script. So you simply need to edit either the registry or the shell script to be able to set up those different parameters. And I will give you some examples in a little bit. But that's probably the last place that you would do your configuring. So I mentioned I was going to show you a couple scenarios of how the Email Engine failover feature really works. And with Service Failover, the Email Engine is no longer tied to a specific AIR server, like I mentioned. So you can have the Email Engine connect through the load balancer to access any one of the AIR servers in the group. This serves two purposes. If any one AIR server is down or unresponsive, the Email Engine doesn't even have a hiccup. It just connects to another server in the group. It also helps to distribute load. So if you had one Email Engine in the past that had a lot of mailboxes, was doing a lot of work, that Email Engine would primarily be connecting to one AIR server, and that server would take the hit. Well, now with being able to use a load balancer, the load can be distributed a little bit better across all the servers in your group. When you configure the Email Engine to work with a load balancer, you just edit the email daemon.properties file and set the server name. So here you can see a snippet of my email daemon.properties file. And these, as you might notice, are the same parameters I have highlighted a little bit earlier. So what I've done here is where all the places where there was a server name, I put in the name remedy prod lb. That's my load balancer name. That resolves my load balancer. So the Email Engine is going to connect through the load balancer for everything. It's going to connect to the load balancer to load the centralized configuration, and then it's going to connect to the load balancer to check to see if there's any outgoing notifications it needs to send. The one thing here that isn't the load balancer name is the companion server name. So that companion server name is the name that Email Engine registers itself with in the service failover forms and in the centralized configuration. So back on the slide where I showed the centralized configuration and it showed two server names, this is where it got it. It got it from the companion server name. Also, when I showed you the service failover ranking and whiteboard forms, you saw a server name there. I will show you a couple more slides with those so you'll see it again if you missed it. But the server name there comes from this companion server name. So that's a real important setting. You can see from the two images here that when one or more AIR servers becomes unresponsive, the Email Engine can still send and receive emails because load balancer would redirect it to an AIR server that's still available. In prior versions, 8.1 and older, the server group failover was based on the status of AIR server alone. So if one AIR server went down or became unresponsive, another AIR server would take over all of its operations, including Email Engine. So the Email Engine that was on a box where the AIR server failed, that Email Engine would fail as well. And in the old environment, only one Email Engine in the entire server group was active at a time. So you can, hopefully those couple things there show you the benefits of this feature. So this feature means that Email Engine will continue running even if the AIR server became unresponsive, and it's not tied to any one server. If AIR server goes down, the Email Engine activity just works fine. So it's just one more way to make your entire ITSM suite a high availability environment. Another scenario is if the Email Engine, this is an example, if an Email Engine providing one of the incoming services fails, what happens? Well, some email engine in the server group is currently running and is the highest ranked companion service at the time for that particular service. It owns the incoming email service and it shows as active in the whiteboard form. In our example, Email Engine 1 owns the incoming email service. So if email engine 1 stops responding for some reason, we don't know why, it could have been brought down cleanly or it crashed, or just for any other reason, it's not sending that heartbeat every 30 seconds. So that's what we say as a failover is the heartbeat isn't detected. We don't know why, we just know the heartbeat isn't being detected. So the server, the one server in the server group that is the current owner of the service failover operation, it notices the lack of a heartbeat. And because there's no heartbeat, it thinks there's something wrong, and it changes the status of the email engine 1 to suspending, which, as we mentioned, and if that email engine was still up and running, just for some reason couldn't send a heartbeat, it now knows to stop anything that it's doing and to relinquish control so there's no duplicates. And then in another interval, it'll then be set to the unavailable status. And again, that service failover operation then makes email engine number 2, which is the next highest ranked companion service, it makes it active for that incoming email service. So that's the flow of things that happens. And in this first diagram on the left, you'll see that we're using the service failover feature to distribute the load across 2 email engines. If you look at the wording there, you'll see POP3 Mailbox is waiting on email engine 1, and SMTP is active. On email engine 2, the POP3 is active. So when I say I distributed the load, I have 2 email engines. One is doing outgoing and one's doing incoming. So that is distributing the load. In the past, I might have had both of those running on a single email engine. And it could be the case that my outgoing mailbox was so busy that it had a hard time keeping up. Especially if there was a ton of incoming as well. This way, I totally separated my incoming and outgoing, and it might make it so that I have better response time for both incoming and outgoing. So, so this not only helps with performance by distributing the load, but it also helps with failover. So you can see on the right-hand side, if email engine 1 failed, then both post offices become unavailable, both services become unavailable, and then email engine 2 becomes active on both of those. So not only is this type of environment good for performance, but it's also perfect for high availability. There's no hiccup. And you can imagine if I had 3 or 4 email engines and several mailboxes, I could map them out, and I could have a fully meshed environment where at any one time, every mailbox is always working on some server. So that's a huge benefit of this service failover feature. So let's change our focus now and look at troubleshooting. First thing we want to do is look at logs. When you're troubleshooting, quite often the first thing you want to do is look at the right log. So in 9.x, there's a log file called email.log. This is the primary email engine log that you'll use, and it's found in the logs directory underneath where the AR email directory is, wherever you installed it. So that's that logs directory. The log contains information from every aspect of the email engine, including every module. So you'll see logging for processing incoming emails, all the way from where it's reading the POP3 or IMAP mailbox, all the way to the point where it's creating a record inside AR server. You'll see logging showing the email engine loading notifications, so querying the AR server, getting the list of notifications. It'll tell you how many it found, and then you'll see the logging showing all the way to the point where it tried to send those messages out to a post office. This log has a settable log level. That was the dot level, if you recall, that I showed you. So it's got a settable level. The default level out of the box is severe. In the example I showed you, I had already set it to finest because I was looking at troubleshooting. So the default severe will record, of course, error messages, and if you want to record a play-by-play, everything that's going on, you can change it to finest. For those of you that have used 8.1 and may not be completely familiar with 9.x, in 8.1 you had the standard error and standard out log files, and those you no longer have. All the information that was in those is now in this email.log file. Here's an example of an email.log file, and just a couple things to point out. You can see the version string of the email engine. So this is something, if you're troubleshooting a problem, you might call support, and they're going to ask you what version and hotfix, whatever. And that version string tells all. So it reports the exact version that it's running. It also reports the version of Java here. So I see I'm using Java 1.8.0.101. And again, these are things that I showed you in other logs, but then you also see during startup. And this example is just from a startup. So if I had showed you an example from later on with sending and receiving emails, you'd see something slightly different. But in here you see the same things I showed you earlier, where it's communicating with the service failover feature, and it's finding it's asserting its state, finding out what mailboxes it owns, and logging all that. So this is the type of level logging that you'd expect to see is a lot. It really gives you information about what the email engine is doing, and therefore it's a prime place to begin your troubleshooting. Another place to look is the AirSystem email error logs form. It actually contains the same the information comes from the same place as the email.log. It's just not as much, but it is presented in more clear format. You can easily access this form from a Remedy client, and that's why there's value to it. In order to look at the email.log, you have to go to the file system. To look at the AirSystem email error logs form, you just have to have a browser client, and then you can find the errors through there. So if you're someone that's monitoring the email engine, monitoring the status of it, you might find that it's easier, whatever you're doing, just to have a browser client look at this form and check to see if there's any errors. This has a settable level, just like the email.log. The level for this, by default, is off. So you may have noticed that you already, from past versions, knew about this form, and you were wanting to use it, and there's nothing in there. Well, the reason is because it's turned off by default. And why is it turned off? Well, for those of you that weren't using it to look at, and you were just using the log, by having this log error messages, it's populating a table in the database. And over time, that table could be fairly large. And if it's not serving a purpose for you, then you're wasting space. So we decided as a 9.x to have the default level be off. And then if you decide that you want to make use of this feature, it's a good feature, you simply need to go and set the AirSystem handler.level to severe. We do recommend that you don't set it higher than severe. You may like the detailed information that you get from like Finest, but remember, all that information is going into the database. It's going into a table. So just be careful about that. Our recommendation is set it to severe so that you can see the errors that are logged, but don't set it higher than that. This is an example of what that form looks like. So I had an error message. It couldn't connect to my post office, and it showed up there. And now if I was using a browser, I saw this, I may or may not want to go and find the email log and dig into it deeper. I may just happen to know that, yeah, someone just told me that post office that IP address is down, so it makes sense. But at least I know, I have the error message, I know what's going on. Depending on the type of problem you're troubleshooting, you may or may not want to use a logging called AR API recording. It really is a useful log. This type of logging actually works on any Remedy Java client. So you might have used, we call it API recording. You might have used the API recording for some other tool, but it's also a really good tool for the email engine. It records all the API activity, including the data that's returned by the API call. To enable it, you simply find the airsys.sample_xml, .xml, rename it to AirSystem_API. That's just because out of box we ship the sample but not the API. So you probably have to rename it, and then you edit it, and you simply change the API recording level from 0 to some integer. And that integer is defined, this is actually a snippet from the XML file. It's commented so you can see exactly what the numbers mean. And so in the case here, I set it to 31. 31 means everything below 32 actually. So it means turn the logging on, record in append mode, record the start and finish time, record the elapsed time, and combine the command and the results into a single file. So that's really a good logging. It gives you everything. 32 is do not record the result data, which I don't want. So anything below 32 is probably a good number to use. And this is an example of what my XML, a snippet anyway, of my XML file looks like. I just changed API recording to 31. And when I restart the email engine, it starts logging all the API calls that email engine is recording. So all the interaction with AIR server is recorded along with the data that was returned. So in this case here, I see a query on the whiteboard form. A GLEWF is a get list entry with fields. It's a query. I see it querying it. And then on the right-hand side, which is just lower in the log, I see the results. And I can interpret this data later. Right now, I don't want to try to interpret it, but at least what I know is that email engine was checking with the whiteboard form. No doubt it was trying to find out what its current status was. So another type of logging, I did mention that you can edit the startup script. So one of the things that you do by editing the startup script is add a debug option, -d mail.debug equals true. This debug option logs connectivity information to your post office. And it's really good information if you suspect, like in that the error logs form I just showed you, there was a connection error. If I want to troubleshoot that, one really good tool I have is this. I simply add this parameter, -d mail.debug equals true, into the startup script. And I'm not going to, I showed an example here of the registry. There is a knowledge article with the references at the end that has a play-by-play for that, so you don't have to understand all this right now, but it's a fairly easy process. You find the parameters key for the service, you increment a JVM option count, and then you create a new string. And it's pretty easy. I'll show you a picture here. So all I did was this JVM option count originally was 4. You can see it's 5 now. I incremented that, and then originally there were 4 JVM option numbers, and I added one. I added this number 4, and I just added that parameter there. Restart the email engine, and I got my logging. And this is what the kind of stuff, this is still the email.log file, but it added some really important stuff. And so what you'll see is that like this debug SMTP, all this stuff, this shows the actual connection to the host using with the port number, the other settings it used. It shows like a telnet session of that connection. So it really gives you a lot of information. And then down here lower, I actually see the actual email that was sent. The body of the email is actually the subject, and the body of the email is actually all in here. So great tool for troubleshooting connection problems to your mail server. The whiteboard form I mentioned earlier, you might not have thought I would use this for troubleshooting, but it is a kind of a good tool because you can look at this last heartbeat field. The last heartbeat, in my case, says that on December 30th was the last time it received a heartbeat. Well, that's because that's when I took the screenshot. If the system is healthy, that would have been within the last 30 seconds because the heartbeat is sent every 30 seconds. If I see a heartbeat that was more than 30 seconds ago, say it was 5 minutes ago, there's something up, and I might want to start looking at that. And then you can also tell from the status, if I have an email engine that's not sending or receiving emails, I come here and it says waiting. Well, that would be the reason why, is because it isn't active, and then I would use that to further troubleshoot why is it not active. And then I could use some of the other tools I mentioned. I could use the AIR API recording feature to look and see did it actually connect to AIR server and look at that whole communication. But so you can use this form just for those couple pieces of data to troubleshoot your email engine. Lastly, there's a new tool, and I wanted to mention this today. This is a brand new tool. It hasn't been announced anywhere. It's announcing to right now for the first time. We want to try to make testing and configuring your email engine as easy as possible for you. And in the past, if you had a connection problem to one of your mail servers, you probably had to do what I just said. You had to look at logs, and you had to go and turn the -d mail.debug equals true and do all that. There's another thing you can do is use this test email utility. It will test the connection to your mail server, and it'll validate all of your mailbox configuration settings. It supports all of the email engine protocols that email engine supports. So like MAPI and Mbox, SMTP, IMAP4, all of those are supported by this tool. And the great thing and the reason why we're promoting it is it provides you immediate feedback. So if you have a problem where things aren't sending, you can go run this tool and you'll know right away. You don't have to grab a bunch of logs, send us support, have us analyze it, and tell you that you have a problem. You can test your configuration out by yourself. This screen might be a little hard to read. This is all documented in a knowledge article. Screenshots like this, examples are all documented in there. And when I run the utility, this is from a Windows box, it runs on Unix as well. I just run test email, and then it prompts me. And you can see all the prompts. It asks me my testing, incoming or outgoing, what's the protocol, what's the host name, all that information it prompts me for. Then it writes out, this section down here, it writes out everything that it's using, and then it tells you that it sends a simple email message. So now I would go to this mailbox, which is the to email address, mailuser@domain.com. I would check its mailbox, and I would see a test email message there. So this, if this worked, I would see that. If I tested incoming, then my results would be, it would show me that it read 5 incoming messages, and it would show me the subjects, proving to me that it actually was able to connect to that mailbox and read it. If I had an error message, then I would see something like this. This is an example, if you can read it. This is an example connecting to an incoming, using incoming with IMAP 4, and for some reason, I must have typed in the login information incorrectly, because it states cannot connect to email server name with the IP address because of authentication failed. Mailbox configuration used, and it gives me all the configuration information. What we're hoping that you do is you open up your AirSystem email mailbox configuration form. You're actually grabbing the exact value that's in there, maybe even copy and paste it in here. We want to test the actual values that you're using, put it in here, and if you did that, if I pasted the exact parameters and I got this error, I've just prevented a problem. I actually did have a problem with my configuration, and I found it here with this utility rather than waiting for someone to complain that they're not getting their notifications. So it's a really good utility. Again, I noted it in the references, so find it, make use of it, see if it helps you out. Here's so I'm done with the information for today. Here's the references. There's 2 pages of references here. Again, we post the recording in the next week or so. We post the recording, and you can come back and grab these links if you'd like. This is pretty much all the stuff I talked about today is all documented here. And there's some knowledge articles that I made reference to, so adding the -d email.debug equals true. I made a brief mention of being able to change the heap size, so there's a knowledge article on that, how to change the Windows registry settings. And then the last one, 129255, is this new utility that you can make use of. So that ends my presentation today. Just as a real quick recap of everything, there's a new service failover feature. You may not have been aware of it. Hopefully now you see the wonders and the beauty of it. It's great for providing high availability in a way that you didn't have before. And distributing the load. The new configuration interface, it makes it so that you can update the configuration on every server in your group from a single place. So it's really cool. There's a new log file that has all the information that used to be in multiple log files in a single place, and so get used to that. And also note, like the -d mail.debug equals true and the log levels, so ways that you can enhance that logging. And lastly, the new troubleshooting tool. Please make use of that if you can. So that concludes the presentation today, and I think we might have a little time for Q&A. Greg?
Thank you, Doug. Thanks for a great presentation. Steve, I believe we have some queued up questions to ask of Doug.
That is correct. We do.
Okay.
Excuse me. We do have several. Okay, Doug. The first question is: what settings are the most helpful when trying to improve performance of outgoing notifications?
Yeah, good question. That does come up a lot. Probably the one thing that we would tell every customer to do is look at the polling interval. There's a lot of times the reason why either incoming or outgoing isn't performing as well as you want is simply because you're using a polling interval that's too high. Out of the box, I believe it's 10 minutes. So if you had an outgoing polling interval of 10 minutes, you can imagine emails may not be sending as much as you'd like. So one of the things that we suggest is to change the polling interval. you actually can change it to seconds. Now, I don't know what the exact polling interval for your environment would be, but you can actually set it down to less than a minute, but maybe setting it down to a minute is a good idea. Another common parameter is it's in the centralized configuration setting. It's one of those I actually showed there earlier, is send email set size. So that's one, and that's documented. And in the docs.vmc.com, you can look at the email daemon settings, and you can go look at send the email set size and look at the recommendations it has for that. That is a very common one to use to improve the performance, because it kind of handles the chunking that email engine does when it's grabbing the notifications.
Great, thanks. The next question is there any special setting I need in order to use a load balancer instead of having the email engine connecting directly to an AR server?
Yeah, another good question. Now that I've talked about using a load balancer, maybe you're asking yourself, okay, that's great, I want to do that, but what are all the gotchas? Now, typically, in a server group environment, you already have a load balancer in front of your AR servers, and that's all we're asking is just connect to that. You may have a reason to do something different, but in general, you can just have the email engine connect to the load balancer that's already in front of your AR servers. And to do that, all you need to do is in that one slide I showed earlier where do you recall I had the companion server name had to be set to the local server name, but every other server name was the load balancer name, and that's it. I simply edit the email daemon.properties file, set the server name to be my load balancer resolvable name, and that's it. Nothing else needs to be done. The part of the features of this service failover was actually to make it so that you didn't have to do anything else. So it's kind of the beauty of the way this thing was designed, was to make it very easy to implement that way.
Great. The next question is, can I force the status of a service or mailbox by editing the whiteboard form?
Okay. Depending on who asked that question, someone might have asked that because they have done it and they've seen it work. We've had customers that reported that all of their email engines were showing as waiting. None of them were active. And they noticed that if they simply changed it to active and clicked on save, then for some time the email engine would work. And so they thought there was maybe a need to have to go in there and change it. Well, the reason why that happened was the customers did not have the service failover operation ranked correctly. And so the service failover operation was not properly coming in, looking at heartbeats, and making some server active. Once we fixed the service failover ranking, it solved the problem. But it kind of did show that if you do come in here and you set the ranking or the status to active, yes, the email engine will notice that. The email engine will when it does its 30-second heartbeat, it will read the status, and the email engine will say, hey, I've noticed that I'm active, and it will become active. But what will happen is the very next heartbeat, assuming that you had service failover ranked correctly, what would happen is the very next heartbeat, the service failover would rank things correctly, and it would force back the statuses to the way they should be. I made a long answer to a short question, but we don't want you to come in and change the statuses there. We want the service failover operation to do it. But if you did manually change them, yes, it would have an effect.
Okay, the next question I have here is, are there any changes in 9.1 regarding the way email attachment data is stored? We find the accumulation of that data to be a big factor in slowed performance.
Yes. In the panel. So there's nothing changed in the area, but due to a defect in our code, we do have a hot fix in 9.1 on SP2 you have the fix.
Okay, great. Next question is, when installing an email engine on a server that doesn't have an a remedy server installed / configured, does the email engine register itself in the server ranking form for email function?
Yes, it does. So the functionality of registering itself is solely with the email engine. So, and I've done this myself. I've put email engines on its own box. And when I started it up for the first time, that companion service name was automatically added. And I turned on that just to be make sure I knew what was going on. I actually turned on that AR API recording. I edited my ARSys_API.xml file and set the recording level to 31. I launched the email engine, and I could see it going in and adding itself to the ranking form. So yes, on wherever email engine is, regardless if there's an AR server on the box, when that email engine starts up, it will add itself to the ranking form. I did notice a customer said that, reported to me that they started the email engine and it didn't add itself. So there might be, and just in case this question came from this kind of a symptom, it's possible that there was a scenario where if you don't have any mailboxes at all, that when the email engine starts up, it doesn't go through the full process and rank itself. So just that, I'm not certain about that, but that might be one caveat, is if there are no mailboxes, it's possible that it won't register itself.
Doug, to me, the question seems like it's whether it's registered in the operations ranking form. I don't think so.
I'm sorry. So the question was about the server group, not the service failover ranking, but the server group operation ranking form?
Right, Steve? Can you double check?
I can reread it.
Okay.
Yeah, that's okay. When installing an email engine on a server that doesn't have a remedy server installed /configured, does the email engine register itself in the server ranking form for email function?
Okay, yeah, so hopefully my answer answered it. The server ranking form might be ambiguous because there's a server group failover, or there's a server group operation ranking form. That's one. That's not used. So no, it doesn't do that. But there is a service failover ranking form, and that is what I just answered for. So hopefully that's clear.
Okay, great. Next question is it possible for third-party processes to register themselves as quote-unquote services for the server to manage?
I say in general, no. There might be some magic way to do it, but in general, no. In fact, if we're talking about for the service failover feature, Remedy only uses two, the normalization engine and email engine, and there's not a way for us to even take, like, say you wanted Recon to become one of these. The feature just doesn't, it wasn't built to support anything beyond those two. It may at a later, it's a great feature, so maybe at a later time something like that will be added, but currently no.
Okay, thank you. Is the service failover logged anywhere, such as the server group operations, or such as where the server group operations are logged?
That's a good question. The server in 9.x, the server group logging has a lot more information in it. If you've noticed that, the things like the updates to the ranking form, they are logged in SQL and filter, and not API logged because they're internal. But there is evidence of it, but we don't have like a service failover log that would give you a play-by-play. You can only infer it or pick it out from some of the other logs, like the SQL logs and the server group logs.
Okay, perfect, thanks. Next question is, does service failover operation support automatic failover to secondary server in case primary goes down?
Automatic fail. I'm not sure I understand the question, because the way the service failover works, if there's two kinds of failover. One would be if the mail server failed over, and that was with that mail server failover form we talked about. But if this feature, the service failover feature, is talking about if any one email engine failed, that is automatic. So I guess there's two pieces of this. There's an automatic failover if an email engine fails, and there's an automatic failover if the connection to a mail server fails, and that's it. If an AR server fails, that's handled by the load balancer. There's nothing needed there. So hopefully I answered the question.
Yep, thank you. Next question is, does service, here it is. I've actually got two more questions. How long does it take the failover to suspend, stop, and start during failover?
It looks like it's 2 intervals, so within a minute it will have changed statuses, and if within 2 minutes it will have changed 2 statuses. So if it went from active to unavailable, it would take about 2 minutes, and that's give or take because there might be 30 seconds on either side of that, so it might be up to 3 minutes. But typically within 2 minutes you'll see the status fully change.
Great, thanks. The next question is, can we configure incoming and outgoing email service ranking to different server? So incoming and outgoing emails can be processed from different server?
Exactly, yes, and that's one of the beauties of this feature, and I tried to show that in some of the slides, is this is a great tool for distributing your load like that. And an example is if you have one incoming and one outgoing, the incoming could be on one email engine and the outgoing on another. If you had 20 mailboxes, you could have 20 email engines all just doing one mailbox if you'd like. So the answer is yes, absolutely, and that's one of the great features of this design.
All right, thank you. The next question is, can you comment on the settings for number of threads, escalations, escalation pools for workflow that converts ITSM messages for a support group into messages for each individual support group member? Email was blamed for delays before we fixed this.
There are, now it's sort of a different topic. I understand why you're tying it to this is because it has to do with notifications getting to the endpoint. So email engine could be blamed for slowness, whereas the actual problem might have been just in the workflow. And whoever asked the question may know that there are out of box a bunch of escalations that are already created to help distribute the load of doing that. It's just that they're out of the box. You only have a certain number of escalation pools. So I guess this is all documented. I don't have the documentation handy, but they're out of the box. We provide an easy ability for you to enable escalations that use other pools. And if you simply add enough pools, then those escalations will run on their own threads, and all that work that needs to be done will be handled on multiple threads. So it's a little bit beyond the scope today, but I do understand the question. I don't know what the ideal number of pools are, and I don't know the names of those escalations, but I know it's fully documented. That's something that I have used and recommended with customers many times.
Great, thank you. All right, we are down to our last question, so I want to throw out a last call to the attendees. So if you do have a question for Doug, go ahead and please use the Q&A section of the WebEx event. All right, the final question, Doug. How do we access the test email utility for Linux?
Now, it's just a good question. I mentioned just briefly that you could run it on Unix. It's basically just a jar file. This solution is Java. So if you're on Linux and you've used some of our utilities, you may have encountered the same problem in the past as we might create a batch file for something but not a shell script, and you had to write your own. We did in the knowledge article, I updated it last night and then made sure it included a shell script. So if that shell script doesn't work on your Unix environment, you might have to modify it, but at least there's a skeleton there that you can use to do it. But because it's just a jar file, it shouldn't be that much more difficult to if the shell script doesn't work for you to fix it and make it work. If there's a problem with it, we do want to make this plug and play. If there's a problem with that knowledge article where that script didn't work for you for some reason and you have an idea or a suggestion, you can let support know.
Great, Doug. Thank you very much for your answers.
My pleasure. Thanks everybody for attending.
All right, here's a slide of the various ways, or showing the various ways you can contact BMC, whether it's through the communities, Facebook, Google, Twitter, and also the technical support information. And that brings this webinar to a close. As always, thank you for your attendance and participation.